I am Natalie, 33 years old, and 12 months ago, I lost everything in a single night. I caught my husband cheating, packed my two young children into my car, and drove through a freezing downpour to my parents' house. My father took one look at his shivering grandchildren, let out a heavy sigh, and shut the solid oak door right in our faces. My sister told me I was being dramatic. Her husband tossed a crumpled $100 bill onto the wet pavement and told me to find a shelter. Hours later, sitting on the edge of a stained motel bed after pawning my wedding ring to get my kids a warm place to sleep, I opened my cracked laptop. I was looking for a bus schedule, but instead I found an email that would destroy the people who had thrown me away. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build an empire from the ashes of a betrayal. The rain was coming down in sheets when I pulled my rusty Honda into the circular driveway of my parents' luxury estate in the affluent suburbs of Chicago. Leo was 8, clutching his school backpack to his chest, and Mia was 6, crying softly in the back seat. I had just walked in on Derek, my husband of 10 years, with his administrative assistant in our bedroom. When I demanded he leave, he laughed in my face, grabbed my keys, and reminded me that the house was solely in his name. So I fled into the night, to the only place I thought would be a safe harbor, William and Catherine. My parents were obsessed with appearances. Divorce was a dirty word in their social circle. When William opened the front door, the golden light of their grand foyer spilled onto the wet concrete porch. He looked at me drenched and shaking, then looked down at Leo and Mia. He did not step aside to let us in. He did not reach out to hug his freezing grandchildren. Instead, he gripped the brass door handle. He told me I was overreacting to a simple mistake and that I needed to go back home and fix my marriage immediately. Then he pushed the heavy door shut, locking it securely from the inside. I stood there in the freezing rain, icy water soaking through my denim jacket, unable to process the cold rejection from my flesh and blood. Desperate and out of options, I drove across town to the gated community where my younger sister Caroline lived with her husband Malik. Malik was an investment banker, incredibly arrogant, and always eager to flaunt his wealth to anyone who would listen. When he opened the heavy mahogany door, he was wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. Caroline stood right behind him holding a glass of red wine, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. I begged them to let the kids sleep on their living room couch for the night. Malik scoffed loudly, adjusting his designer watch. He said I needed to find a shelter. He explicitly told me he had senior partners from Goldman Sachs arriving early the next morning for a networking retreat, and he could not have crying kids ruining his business deals. Caroline rolled her eyes and took a sip of wine. She told me I always overreact, that Derek is a good financial provider, and that I should just go back and apologize to him for causing a scene. Apologize to the man who cheated on me in my own bed. Malik reached into his leather wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, crumpled it up, and threw it onto the wet porch at my feet. He told me to take the trash out of his driveway and slammed the door shut. I stared at the crumpled green paper slowly soaking up the rain. I did not pick it up. I turned my back on their massive house, walked to my beat-up Honda, and secured Leo and Mia in their car seats. I looked into the rearview mirror, met their terrified eyes, and promised them everything was going to be completely fine. I drove to a cheap motel right off the interstate highway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hand my credit card to the night clerk behind the dirty bulletproof glass. The machine beeped a loud, angry sound. Declined. I tried my debit card. Declined. Derek had frozen every joint account we shared within minutes of me leaving the house. I had exactly $12 in cash. I told the kids to wait in the locked car while I ran across the dark street to a brightly lit 24-hour pawn shop. I took off my wedding ring, the ultimate symbol of a decade of lies, and slammed it onto the glass counter. The pawnbroker gave me exactly $300. It was a mere fraction of its actual value, but it was enough to pay for 2 nights in a warm room and buy some hot food for my hungry children. Back in the dim motel room, I tucked Leo and Mia into the stiff sheets. Once their breathing finally steadied, I sat at the wobbly desk and opened my cracked laptop. For 3 years, I had stayed up until 3 in the morning, secretly coding an artificial intelligence market analysis tool while Derek slept oblivious beside me. I connected to the terrible motel internet planning to search for cheap rental apartments. Instead, an email popped into my inbox from a massive Silicon Valley venture capital firm. The subject line made my heart stop entirely. They had reviewed my algorithm. They were offering a $15 million Series A buyout, and they wanted me to retain full CEO status. The harsh morning sunlight filtered through the thin, stained curtains of the motel room. I sat at a wobbly wooden desk, wearing a faded gray hoodie, staring into the camera of my cracked laptop. On the screen were 3 venture capital executives sitting in a sleek Silicon Valley boardroom. We were finalizing the legal transfer of my artificial intelligence algorithm. For 3 years, I had built this predictive data software while Derek slept hiding my work behind password-protected folders. Now the lead investor was confirming the terms. I would retain my title as Chief Executive Officer, and they were executing a complete buyout of the software rights. A $15 million wire transfer was scheduled to hit my newly established private account by 3 o'clock this afternoon. I gave a polite nod, thanked them for their partnership, and ended the secure call. My hands were perfectly steady. Before I could even close the laptop, my phone began vibrating violently against the cheap laminate desk. The screen lit up with 6 missed calls from Catherine, my mother. A barrage of text messages followed. She demanded my immediate presence at the Silver Spoon Diner downtown, claiming we needed to discuss the absolute disaster I had caused by walking out on my marriage. She explicitly stated that if I did not show up, she and my father would involve Child Protective Services. I took a deep breath, grabbed my keys, and walked out to my rusted Honda Civic. Let them think I was terrified. Let them think I was crawling back for mercy. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and heavy grease. I spotted them immediately in a worn leather booth near the back. William and Catherine sat on one side, both dressed in pristine golf attire, radiating their usual wealthy arrogance. Sitting directly across from them, sipping a black coffee with a smug, self-satisfied grin, was Derek. The man I had caught in our bed with another woman less than 12 hours ago was currently swapping pleasantries with my own parents. I slid into the booth next to him, keeping my expression entirely blank. Neither of my parents offered a greeting. They did not ask if Leo and Mia had slept well or if we had enough to eat. Catherine immediately launched into her attack. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand on the table and leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. "You dropped out of your master program to have Leo." She sneered, her eyes scanning my cheap hoodie with absolute disgust. "You threw away a perfectly good academic path to be a stay-at-home mother, and now you want to blow up your family over a meaningless mistake?" Derek is a highly respected regional director. Men in his position have certain needs, Natalie. You actually think you can survive as a single mom. You have 0 income and 0 prospects. You will be scrubbing toilets by next month just to feed those kids. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me. The absolute lack of empathy was staggering, yet entirely predictable. My parents worshipped social status and financial stability above all else. Derek possessed a lucrative corporate job while I was, in their eyes, a pathetic dependent who contributed nothing to society. Derek chuckled, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and tossed a thick, stapled stack of legal documents onto the sticky table right in front of me. "Those are expedited divorce and custody papers," Derek stated, his voice laced with unearned superiority. "I am filing for full physical and legal custody of Leo and Mia. I will not have my children living in some roach-infested motel because their mother decided to throw a temper tantrum." He leaned closer, his breath hot against my face. "I am taking the kids, Natalie, and I am doing it, so I do not have to pay you a single dime in child support. You get nothing. Not the house, not my savings, and definitely not my money." Before I could utter a word, William pointed a stern finger at my face. He delivered his threat with cold, calculated precision. "If you try to fight Derek in court, if you ask a judge for spousal support, or try to drag this family name through the mud, I will personally finance Derek's legal team. I will hire the most ruthless, expensive divorce attorneys in Chicago. We will bury you in endless litigation until you are drowning in debt and entirely ruined. You have no money, Natalie. You cannot win. Sign the papers. Quietly hand over the kids, and maybe Derek will let you see them on alternate weekends. They sat there, a unified front of toxicity, staring at me like I was a bug they were waiting to crush. They truly believed I was entirely broke, defenseless, and backed into a corner. I looked down at the legal documents. I slowly flipped through the thick pages until I found the financial separation clause. Derek's lawyer had drafted an aggressively brutal contract. It included a complete waiver of spousal support and a mutual surrender of any claim to each other's current and future financial assets. By signing this, neither party could ever touch a single cent of the other person's wealth. I reached into my hoodie pocket and pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen. I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not argue. I simply clicked the pen, turned to the final page, and signed my name on every single dotted line without a second of hesitation. Derek burst into a loud, triumphant laugh, shaking his head at my apparent surrender. He snatched the papers back across the table, inspecting the signatures to ensure they were valid. "You really are a naive, stupid loser," he gloated, sliding the documents back into his jacket. "You just signed away everything." I stood up from the booth, looking down at the three people who had just conspired to destroy my life. Derek was smiling like a king who had just conquered a kingdom. He had absolutely no idea what he had just done. By forcing me to sign away my rights to his modest savings and demanding a complete financial separation, he had just legally walled himself off from the $15 million wire transfer hitting my private account that very afternoon. 30 days later, my dual life was running with absolute precision. I leased a cramped ground-floor apartment in a deteriorating complex on the edge of the city. Water-stained ceilings, peeling linoleum, and a perpetually broken security gate made it the perfect decoy. I invited my mother over exactly once. She stayed for 4 minutes, refused to sit on the second-hand sofa I bought from a thrift store, and left a $20 bill on the chipped laminate counter with a look of profound pity. She rushed back to her country club friends, armed with fresh gossip about her tragic, impoverished daughter. She had no idea that my actual residence was a 10,000-square-foot penthouse in the financial district, purchased entirely in cash through a blind LLC. My children slept in custom beds overlooking the skyline, guarded by private security. My days were spent orchestrating the expansion of my newly acquired $15 million fortune. But to my family, I was merely surviving on food stamps. My phone buzzed with a sharp text from my brother Ethan. He did not ask how I was doing, or if Leo and Mia were adjusting to our new life. He sent a hard command to be at our parents' house by noon. I parked my rusted Honda Civic behind Malik's pristine Range Rover in the sprawling circular driveway. The contrast was stark and entirely intentional. I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors and found Ethan and Malik lounging in my father's leather armchairs in the formal study. They were sipping expensive bourbons, celebrating a victory I had yet to learn about. Ethan did not bother standing when I walked in. He gestured vaguely toward a stack of disorganized file folders on the heavy oak desk. He told me that since I was completely unemployed and relying on state handouts, I finally had time to make myself useful to the family. He and Malik had just launched a joint real estate investment firm. Ethan smirked, reminding me of the time I spent my entire Thanksgiving weekend formatting his business school thesis, just so he could go on a luxury ski trip with his fraternity brothers. He expected the exact same mindless obedience now. He said my previous coding projects were a cute little hobby, but real wealth was built by men who understood market aggression and high-stakes negotiations. Malik leaned forward, adjusting his platinum cufflinks, and used his polished investment banker voice to degrade my entire existence. He told me I would be answering their phones, fetching their coffee, and organizing their client portfolios for zero pay. He called it an unpaid internship to help me build character and maybe earn a decent reference for when I eventually applied for a cashier job at the local supermarket. He made a point to mention that his Goldman Sachs partners would be highly amused to see my fall from grace. I stood in the center of the study, my hands folded neatly in front of my cheap gray hoodie. I asked them why two highly successful financial minds could not afford to hire a basic administrative assistant. Ethan scoffed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He stated they were operating lean because they were preparing to pitch a massive commercial buyout next week. He claimed they were targeting a corporate acquisition that would permanently cement their status in the top 1% of the city. He needed absolute secrecy and someone desperate enough to keep their mouth shut without asking for a paycheck. I looked directly at Malik, keeping my expression entirely blank, and asked him which venture capital firm they were pitching this brilliant idea to. Malik laughed, a loud booming sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of my father's study. He stood up, towering over me in his tailored suit, and shook his head in sheer disbelief at my audacity. He said the firm was Apex Capital. He added that a grocery clerk like me would not know them, but they were the most ruthless, heavily funded proxy firm operating out of Silicon Valley. He bragged that he had a direct line to their senior acquisition manager and that his pitch was an absolute lock. Catherine walked into the study just in time to hear the end of his boast. She patted Malik on the shoulder and shot me a look of pure disappointment. She told me I should be taking notes from my brilliant brother-in-law instead of standing around looking like a vagrant. She instructed me to take the files home, organize them alphabetically by Monday morning, and warned me not to spill cheap coffee on the expensive parchment paper because they needed to present a flawless image. I did not argue. I did not defend my intelligence or demand the respect I rightfully deserved. I simply picked up the heavy stack of manila folders, nodded obediently, and walked out the front door. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective under the gray sky. I threw the files onto the passenger seat of my Honda, got behind the steering wheel, and locked the doors. Once I was entirely out of view from the towering windows of my parents' estate, I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out my secondary phone. It was a secure, encrypted device completely disconnected from my old life. I hit speed dial for my lead wealth manager in San Francisco. He answered on the first ring with strict professional courtesy. I asked him to pull up the upcoming calendar for Apex Capital. I confirmed that Apex Capital was indeed my newly established proxy firm, the exact corporate shield we had built to manage my $15 million tech buyout. My manager confirmed that a pitch from Malik and Ethan was officially scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon. I looked back at the sprawling brick mansion in the rearview mirror and gave my final instruction. I told my manager that when Ethan and Malik walk into that boardroom next week, they are going to pitch the deal of their lives. I ordered him to make absolutely sure their table microphones were wired directly to my private earpiece. I was going to hear every single lie they told. Testing. Can you hear me, Marcus? I adjusted my earpiece, pacing the marble floors of my penthouse. Above the Chicago skyline, I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun reflected off the glass towers around me, a sharp contrast to the damp motel where this journey started exactly 3 months ago. The professional voice of my wealth manager crackled to life. Loud and clear, Natalie. The targets have entered the boardroom. Perfect, I whispered. Through the audio feed, the ambient noise of the Apex Capital boardroom filtered in. Ethan and Malik were sitting exactly where I wanted them. I pulled up the live security feed on my tablet. Malik was sweating through his suit, his knee bouncing under the heavy glass table. Ethan looked out of his depth, flipping through a stack of manila folders. Those were the exact same folders they had forced me to organize for free just days prior, treating me like a servant. Marcus sat at the head of the table, playing the proxy director with absolute perfection. He folded his hands. Gentlemen, you are asking Apex Capital for a $5 million commercial loan. Your firm is 3 months old and lacks a track record. Why should I risk my client's capital? Malik launched into his pitch, entirely oblivious that the client he was trying to impress was watching from miles away. He boasted about his years in investment banking, claiming his strategy could yield a 40% return in 6 months. It was pure financial fantasy. He threw out buzzwords to mask a reckless business model. The strategy is irrelevant without secure collateral, Marcus stated coldly, echoing the instructions I had typed to him. Apex Capital requires tangible leverage for a $5 million release. On the screen, Ethan froze. He looked at Malik with panic. They barely had $50,000 in operating cash. I watched Malik swallow hard, straighten his silk tie, and prepare to deliver the ultimate lie I had been waiting for. "We have collateral," Malik said with forced bravado. "We have exclusive rights to leverage the primary family estate in Oakbrook. It is a paid-off property appraised at $7 million. I gripped the edge of the counter. He was talking about William and Catherine's house. My parents' massive estate was the ultimate symbol of their social superiority. Malik was offering up my parents' home as collateral for his reckless gamble. "Are you the legal owners of this estate?" Marcus asked. "My father-in-law William is the owner," Malik lied smoothly. "He is a silent partner in our firm. We have his documented consent to use the property as a hard asset. He fully supports our growth strategy." I stared at the tablet screen in pure shock. Malik was forging my parents' consent. He was leveraging the roof over their heads without them knowing a single thing. I pressed the microphone button. "Marcus," I said, my voice icy. "Do not decline the loan. Accept the collateral. But tell them they have to sign a rapid acceleration clause. If they default on a single payment or divert these funds for personal use, we seize the Oak Brook house immediately. No grace period. Complete forfeiture." Marcus did not flinch. Apex Capital accepts the Oak Brook estate as collateral. However, due to the high-risk nature of your firm, I require a rapid acceleration clause. If you miss one payment, or if an audit reveals any misappropriation of funds, Apex Capital claims the title to the estate instantly. On the security feed, Ethan leaned over and grabbed Malik's arm. "We cannot risk Mom and Dad's house," Ethan hissed into the boardroom microphones. "If we miss a deadline, we are ruined," Malik scoffed, swatting Ethan's hand away. "Shut up, Ethan. We are going to double this money in 90 days. Your parents will never know the house was on the line." Malik turned back to Marcus with an arrogant smile. "We accept your terms. Where do we sign?" Marcus slid a leather-bound contract across the table. Malik grabbed a fountain pen and signed his name with a dramatic flourish. He did not bother to read the fine print or the secondary clauses I had drafted. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before signing his name beneath Malik's. They had just handed me the keys to my parents' kingdom. "Pleasure doing business," Marcus said, standing up. I watched the two men celebrate in the elevator via the lobby camera feed. They were high-fiving, convinced they had manipulated a Silicon Valley firm into funding their reckless ambition. They thought they were the predators in this scenario. They had no idea they had walked willingly into a financial slaughterhouse. I sat down at my kitchen island, opened my secure banking portal, and authorized the $5 million wire transfer from Apex Capital directly into Malik's corporate account. The trap was officially set. Just as the transfer confirmation appeared on my screen, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a text message from Catherine. I opened it expecting another demand for free labor. "Natalie, your brother and Malik just secured a massive $5 million investment. We are having a massive family dinner on Sunday to celebrate their success. Come over to the house at 5. Use the back door. You need to wash the dishes and serve the appetizers so we do not have to hire catering staff." I stared at the message, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face as I read her words. They wanted me to use the back door of the very house I now held the legal right to seize. They wanted me to serve their appetizers and wash their dirty dishes, just to celebrate the exact loan I had just funded to destroy them. "I will be there," I typed back to her. "I cannot wait to celebrate." Month 4 of my entirely separate existence began with a mandated appearance at the Oak Brook estate. It was William's 65th birthday. I parked my rusted Honda Civic near the end of the long driveway, deliberately making the walk up to the grand entrance in the damp evening air. I wore faded jeans and the gray hoodie they despised. The heavy oak doors were propped open, spilling warm light and the sound of clinking crystal out onto the stone portico. I stepped inside the foyer and was immediately hit by the scent of expensive truffle hors d'oeuvres and imported champagne. They had hired a premium catering company, complete with uniformed waitstaff, circulating through the crowded living room. My parents were throwing the party of the decade entirely funded by the predatory loan they did not even know was tied to the very floorboards beneath their feet. I navigated through the sea of extended family members and my parents' country club associates. No one offered a greeting. I blended into the background, scanning the room until I spotted the guests of honor. William stood by the grand fireplace holding court with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Catherine was beside him, draped in a new diamond necklace that undoubtedly cost a small fortune. But the truly sickening sight was seated on the plush, velvet sofa just a few feet away. Derek, my ex-husband, was lounging with his arm wrapped around a blonde girl who looked 22. She was giggling loudly, practically sitting on Catherine's lap while my mother poured her another glass of vintage wine. They had welcomed my cheating ex-husband and his teenage mistress into the family fold with open arms, treating them like royalty while I was expected to serve as their unpaid maid. I walked toward the kitchen, intending to slip through the swinging doors and wait out the night, but Catherine spotted me. She cut through the crowd, her diamond necklace catching the light, and blocked my path. She looked me up and down, her expression contorting into a mask of pure disgust. She snapped her fingers, holding out an open palm. She demanded I hand over the keys to my car immediately. She stated that Ethan and Malik had just hired a new batch of unpaid college interns for their highly successful investment firm, and the boys needed a spare vehicle to run errands around the financial district. She looked at my faded jeans and told me I had absolutely no need for a car since I was unemployed and thoroughly useless. She instructed me to take the city bus back to whatever miserable hole I was currently living in. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her demand, William stepped up right behind her. He placed a heavy hand on Catherine's shoulder and glared down at me. He told me I had always been the most selfish person in this family. His voice boomed over the ambient noise of the party, ensuring that everyone nearby could hear his public reprimand. He brought up a piece of ancient family history, reminding me of the time I flatly refused to drain my own hard-earned college savings account just to pay for my sister Caroline's extravagant destination wedding. He claimed my refusal to fund Caroline was proof that I lacked any sense of family loyalty. He said my current pathetic state was just karma for being so unwilling to support the people who raised me. The absolute delusion was staggering. They had expected me to sacrifice my education for a party, just as they now expected me to sacrifice my only mode of transportation so Ethan could look like a big shot to his interns. Derek noticed the commotion and wandered over his young mistress, clinging tightly to his arm. He smirked, taking a sip of his bourbon. He told William not to be too hard on me because losing my marriage had clearly broken my spirit. Malik and Ethan joined the circle, standing tall in their custom suits paid for by my money. They crossed their arms, waiting to see if I would throw a tantrum or break down in tears. I looked at the ring of hostile faces surrounding me. They were all waiting for a fight. They wanted to see me beg to keep my worthless car. Instead, I reached into the front pocket of my gray hoodie. I pulled out the worn plastic keychain, holding the single key to the Honda Civic. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my dignity. I simply dropped the keys right into Catherine's outstretched palm. The metal jingled sharply against her diamond rings. The group burst into cruel laughter. Derek shook his head, whispering to his mistress about how completely pathetic I had become. Ethan snatched the keys from Catherine, tossing them in the air and catching them with a triumphant grin. They honestly believed they had ground me down into nothing. They thought I was a broken, compliant victim, handing over my last worldly possession. I offered a tight, polite nod to my father, wishing him a happy birthday, and turned my back on them. I walked straight out the heavy oak front doors and down the sweeping stone steps into the cool night air. I did not walk toward the bus stop at the end of the neighborhood. I stood at the edge of the driveway. Seconds later, a sleek midnight black Maybach glided silently up the long driveway, its tinted windows gleaming under the estate lights. A driver in a sharp black suit stepped out, instantly opening the rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather interior. Up in the house, Derek's mistress happened to look out the massive bay window. I watched her jaw drop as she lost her grip entirely. Her crystal wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering into 100 pieces on the hardwood floor as the Maybach sped away into the dark. 30 days after I drove away from my father's birthday party, in a tinted Maybach, Ethan finally tracked down the address of my decoy apartment. It was month 5 of my meticulous financial separation. I had specifically chosen this ground floor unit in the most dilapidated complex on the city's industrial edge for moments exactly like this. To sell the illusion of my total ruin, I had even hired 2 struggling theater actors to play my neighbors. For $300 a week, they left empty beer bottles near my welcome mat and regularly staged loud, obnoxious arguments right outside my window. The staging was flawless. I was sitting at the wobbly kitchen table reviewing the offshore accounts of my tech empire on a secure tablet when a violent crash rattled the cheap door frames. Someone was kicking the front door with terrifying force. The thin wood splintered slightly around the deadbolt as a second kick landed. Ethan did not bother to knock. He simply pounded his expensive leather loafer against the door until I walked over and unlatched the chain. He shoved past me the second the door opened, his face flushed with a desperate, frantic energy I had never seen before. He looked around the cramped, dimly lit apartment with absolute revulsion, stepping over a stained rug to stand in the center of the cramped living room. He wore a rumpled designer suit, and his eyes were bloodshot. The pressure from the Apex Capital loan was clearly beginning to crush him and Malik. He did not offer a greeting. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick legal document, and slapped it down onto the sticky laminate counter. He demanded I sign a quitclaim deed to our late grandmother's cabin up in the northern woods. He stated that Malik had just made a catastrophic trade on the market, and their new firm was hemorrhaging cash. They needed immediate liquid capital to cover their margins, and selling the old family cabin was their only viable option. I stared at the paperwork, keeping my posture defensive and small. I reminded him that grandmother had explicitly left that property to both of us, jointly intending for it to remain a family retreat. I told him I would not surrender my half of the inheritance just to bail out Malik's reckless gambling. Ethan stepped closer, invading my personal space. His voice dropped into a vicious, calculated threat. He sneered, gesturing wildly at the peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew permeating the room. He told me this apartment was an absolute slum, a hazardous environment, unfit for human habitation, let alone children. He explicitly stated that if I did not sign away my rights to the cabin immediately, he would make a phone call to Child Protective Services. He promised to testify that I was living in squalor and personally finance a legal team to help Derek take full permanent custody of Leo and Mia. He leaned in, his breath reeking of stale coffee, and panic, whispering that I would lose my kids by Friday if I did not pick up a pen. He knew exactly which buttons to push, or at least he thought he did. Using my children as leverage was a classic family tactic, brutal and devoid of any basic empathy. I let my breathing hitch, forcing my hands to tremble visibly as I looked down at the legal document. I backed away, pressing my shoulders against the cheap drywall, acting entirely backed into a corner. I begged him not to call Derek, letting a single perfectly timed tear slip down my cheek. I told him he could have the cabin, the land, everything, as long as he left my children out of his financial mess. Ethan laughed, a harsh, victorious sound that echoed in the small room. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and shoved it into my shaking hand. He ordered me to sign the bottom line, mocking my apparent weakness, gloating about how easy it was to put me back in my place. I read over the document through my feigned tears. His lawyer had drafted it perfectly for my purposes. The quitclaim deed transferred 100% of the property rights, liabilities, and ownership directly into Ethan's sole name. By signing it, I was completely severing my legal connection to the land. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. Ethan snatched the document the second the ink was dry. He checked the signature, his arrogant smirk returning in full force. He told me I was a pathetic pushover and warned me to stay out of his way before turning on his heel. He slammed the front door shut behind him. I stood completely still for 3 seconds, listening to his heavy footsteps recede down the concrete walkway. Outside, I heard him cheer, shouting a victory through his cell phone to Malik, bragging about how he had just bullied his broke sister into handing over a free asset. I walked over to the door, slid the deadbolt back into place, and reached into the pocket of my hoodie to retrieve my encrypted secondary phone. I wiped the fake tear from my cheek. My posture straightened instantly, the trembling in my hands replaced by cold, absolute precision. I tapped a secure speed dial number. My lead environmental attorney in Washington answered immediately. I asked if the transfer was complete. He confirmed the county clerk had processed the quitclaim deed. Ethan was now the sole owner of the property on the public record. I walked to the window, pulling back the dusty blind to watch Ethan speed away in his sports car, celebrating his total financial victory. My lawyer chuckled softly over the secure line. He informed me the Environmental Protection Agency had just issued a mandatory $2 million hazardous waste cleanup fine on that exact property today. Ethan is now personally liable for federal environmental violations. Goodbye, Ethan. Month 6 of my financial independence arrived. Ethan and Malik were already drowning in federal environmental fines and suffocating under their Apex Capital loan, entirely unaware I was the phantom executioner holding the axe. But my ex-husband Derek required a more personal touch. He summoned me to Le Petit Chateau, a notoriously pretentious French restaurant situated downtown. I arrived exactly on time, wearing the same faded gray hoodie and worn jeans I utilized to sell my impoverished facade since our divorce. The maitre d' looked at me with undisguised disdain, reluctantly escorting me to a secluded corner booth where Derek was waiting. Derek looked like a man who had conquered the universe. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that screamed of new money. A heavy diamond-encrusted Rolex caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above us as he raised his hand to signal the staff. He did not bother to greet me. He simply pointed a manicured finger at the empty chair across from him, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. I sat down silently, resting my hands on the pristine white tablecloth. The waitress, a young college student looking visibly exhausted, hurried over with a notepad. Derek did not even look at her. He snapped his fingers aggressively, demanding their most expensive reserve Cabernet and imported beluga caviar. When she politely asked for a moment to verify the vintage, Derek sneered. He told her to stop wasting his valuable time and do her basic job properly, insulting her intelligence loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. He waved her away like a bothersome insect, leaning back against the leather booth with absolute entitlement. I watched him perform his toxic arrogance, keeping my expression entirely blank. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table, eager to deliver the crushing blow he had called me here to witness. He announced, his voice dripping with superiority, that he had just been promoted to Regional Director of Vanguard Technologies. He puffed out his chest, stating he was now pulling in a high 6-figure salary, complete with a massive equity package, quarterly bonuses, and an executive expense account. He wanted to make absolutely certain I understood the magnitude of his corporate success while I was allegedly surviving on food stamps. Since my income has skyrocketed, Derek began, his tone vicious and calculated. I instructed my legal team to file a formal motion modifying our custody arrangement. I am taking Leo and Mia for full weekends at my new 6-bedroom mansion in the suburbs. My 22-year-old girlfriend absolutely loves the kids, and they deserve to experience a lifestyle of wealth that you could never possibly provide for them. I reached for my water glass, taking a slow, measured sip. The ice clinked softly against the glass. I did not say a single word. I did not react. Derek leaned closer, mistaking my silence for submission. He told me his lawyers were drafting a motion to bury me in legal fees. He promised to drag out the custody modification until I was forced to declare complete bankruptcy. He smiled, an ugly, triumphant twisting of his features, declaring that I would be scrubbing floors for minimum wage while he raised our children in absolute luxury. He said I was a pathetic, socially unfit loser who had thrown away a perfectly good marriage over a meaningless mistake, and this ruin was the inevitable consequence of my stupidity. The waitress returned her hands, shaking slightly as she placed the expensive wine and the plate of caviar on the table. Derek rolled his eyes harshly, criticizing the way she poured the wine, complaining loudly that the glass was smudged and the temperature was wrong. He demanded she fetch the general manager immediately so he could have her fired on the spot for sheer incompetence. I remained entirely silent. I watched the young waitress hurry away in tears, her shoulders shaking. I looked back at Derek, my face a mask of absolute chilling calm. Derek slammed his hand against the table, making the expensive silverware rattle violently against the porcelain plates. My total lack of reaction was visibly infuriating him. He expected hysterical tears. He expected me to beg for mercy, to plead with him not to take my children away, or bankrupt me with aggressive corporate litigation. He demanded to know why I was not crying. He asked if I was truly too stupid to understand that he held all the power and was about to ruin my life permanently. Right on cue, my encrypted secondary phone began to vibrate from the front pocket of my gray hoodie. The harsh digital ringtone pierced the quiet, refined atmosphere of the upscale restaurant. Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes in disgust, and commanded me to turn off my cheap prepaid phone before the restaurant management threw me out into the street. I did not turn it off. I pulled the black device from my pocket, placed it directly in the center of the white tablecloth, and hit the speaker button. Marcus, my proxy director at Apex Capital, spoke with crisp corporate efficiency. His voice carried perfectly over the restaurant noise. Ma'am, Marcus announced the hostile takeover of Vanguard Technologies is complete. The board of directors has finalized the restructuring plan. You are now the majority shareholder and hold absolute controlling interest over the entire firm. Derek froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale white. His eyes darted frantically from the phone to my face, his brain struggling to process the impossible words he had just heard. Vanguard Technologies was his entire company. It was the source of his new wealth, his mansion, and his arrogant leverage over me. I looked dead into Derek's eyes, watching the terrifying realization wash over him as his entire world collapsed in real time. I am not crying, Derek, I stated, my voice cold and steady, because I am your new boss. 30 days later, month 7 of my meticulously executed plan commenced. Derek sat in his corner glass office at Vanguard Technologies, sweating profusely into the collar of his custom Italian shirt. He had spent the entire month convincing himself that the phone call at the restaurant was an elaborate bluff. He rationalized that his unemployed, allegedly destitute former wife could not possibly possess the capital to orchestrate a hostile corporate takeover. Through the transparent glass walls of his office, I watched him pace frantically behind his massive mahogany desk. He barked orders into his headset, demanding his subordinates finalize a quarterly report that no longer belonged to him. He was a man desperately clinging to an illusion of control, entirely blind to the guillotine swinging down toward his neck. The panoramic city views offered no escape from the devastating reality that was about to completely shatter his fragile world. I stood in the corridor, flanked by the human resources director and 2 towering security guards. I had permanently shed the faded gray hoodie and the keys to the rusted Honda Civic. Today I wore a $5,000 tailored charcoal suit cut with razor-sharp precision. The silk lining whispered against my skin as I signaled the guards to proceed. They pushed open the heavy glass door without knocking. Derek snapped his head up, his face contorting into a mask of indignant rage. He demanded to know who had authorized them to interrupt his conference call. He shouted that he was the regional director and threatened to terminate everyone in the room for insubordination. His tirade abruptly died in his throat as I stepped out from behind the imposing wall of security personnel. I walked slowly into the center of his office, my heels clicking methodically against the polished hardwood floor. I folded my hands perfectly in front of me, staring at him with absolute, terrifying composure. Derek dropped his headset onto the desk. A nervous, high-pitched laugh escaped his lips. He clapped his hands together, looking around at the grim faces of the HR director and the security detail. He loudly declared that this was a fantastic, highly coordinated practical joke. He told the room that his former wife had always possessed a strange sense of humor and congratulated me on pulling off such a convincing corporate stunt. He stepped around the mahogany desk, reaching out to pat my shoulder, instructing the guards they were dismissed so we could catch up privately. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked at his outstretched hand with pure, unadulterated disgust until he slowly pulled it back. The awkward silence stretched, suffocating the last remnants of his bravado. The reality of the situation finally pierced his thick skull. This was absolutely not a prank. I was no longer a helpless victim. I unclasped the leather portfolio I carried and pulled out a thick-bound audit report. I slammed it down onto the exact center of his pristine mahogany desk. The heavy thud echoed sharply against the glass walls. I stated that, as the new majority shareholder of Vanguard Technologies, my first official directive was a comprehensive forensic audit of all regional executive accounts. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. I reminded him of the countless times during our marriage when he swore he was working late, claiming he was putting in unpaid overtime just to secure a better future for our family. I told him I knew those late nights were spent lying in hotel beds with other women. Now he had simply upgraded his deception. I tapped the audit report, stating it contained irrefutable proof that he had been systematically embezzling company funds for the past 6 months. He was routing corporate capital through dummy vendor accounts to purchase diamond tennis bracelets and luxury vacations for his 22-year-old mistress. Derek visibly, physically crumbled. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His knees buckled and he dropped heavily onto the hardwood floor, landing right at the tips of my expensive shoes. He clasped his hands together, his arrogant sneer replaced by pathetic, blubbering sobs. He begged me to immediately suppress the audit. He pleaded for my mercy, desperately citing that we shared 2 beautiful children together. He sobbed that Leo and Mia needed a father who was not incarcerated for corporate fraud. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, cold, clinical satisfaction. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. I reminded him of the freezing night in November when he locked the front door of our marital home, threw my suitcases onto the wet pavement, and forced me out into the pouring rain. I reminded him that he did not care about Leo and Mia having a mother when he deliberately ripped my life apart. I straightened my posture, addressing the Human Resources Director, standing silently by the door. I officially terminated Derek immediately for severe corporate malfeasance. I explicitly instructed HR to completely revoke his severance package, cancel his stock options, and void his executive pension. I told the security team to confiscate his company phone, his keys, and escort him out of the building through the main lobby. Derek wailed, scrambling to gather his personal belongings as the guards hauled him roughly to his feet. They dragged him out of the glass office, his cries of ruin echoing down the corporate hallway for all of his former subordinates to hear. I stood alone in the quiet office, savoring the absolute destruction of his pride. Seconds later, my lead forensic auditor slipped quietly through the open doorway. He approached me holding a secondary financial ledger. He lowered his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper. "Ma'am, we successfully tracked the final destination of the embezzled money." Derek was not just buying jewelry. He was secretly funneling the stolen corporate capital directly into Malik's private investment firm. Month 8 arrived with the absolute collapse of Derek's fabricated empire. Facing imminent federal indictment for corporate fraud and completely stripped of his assets, my former husband crawled back to the only place he thought still harbored wealth. He went straight to my parents' estate in Oak Brook. I monitored the entire situation through the security cameras I had quietly installed inside the living room when I was supposedly organizing their files months ago. The audio feed was crystal clear. The grand living room, previously the site of their smug celebrations, had transformed into a war zone. Derek paced frantically in front of the marble fireplace, his designer suit replaced by wrinkled sweatpants, begging William for a massive loan to cover his mounting legal fees. William sat in his leather armchair nursing a scotch, his face purple with rage. He did not offer sympathy. He offered absolute contempt. He screamed that Derek was a colossal liability who had humiliated the family name. Malik and Ethan stood by the mahogany wet bar, looking entirely cornered. Malik slammed his glass down, the sharp crack echoing through the room. He marched up to Derek and shoved him hard against the mantel. Malik was furious, completely unconcerned with Derek's impending prison sentence. His only concern was the sudden halt of the illicit funds Derek had been secretly funneling into his startup. Malik yelled that Derek had ruined their cash flow projection, demanding to know how he was supposed to artificially inflate his quarterly earnings without the stolen corporate capital Derek had promised him. Derek pushed Malik back, his voice cracking with panic. He screamed that he had already risked federal prison to bankroll Malik's fraudulent investment firm, reminding the room that Malik had blown through the embezzled money in a matter of weeks on terrible market trades. Ethan stepped between them, sweating profusely, looking completely hollowed out. Ethan yelled at them both to shut up, claiming he had his own massive problems to deal with since the cabin transfer. William slammed his fist onto the coffee table, immediately taking Malik's side. He pointed a trembling finger at Derek, declaring that Malik was a financial visionary who just needed a temporary bridge loan, while Derek was nothing but a sloppy criminal who got caught. The family was actively cannibalizing itself, tearing each other apart over money that never truly belonged to them. Catherine sat on the velvet sofa, clutching her diamond necklace, looking between the screaming men. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed my number. I sat in my penthouse kitchen watching her make the call on the live feed and pressed the answer button on my primary device. I simultaneously tapped the record icon. Catherine did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was shrill, dripping with the familiar toxic entitlement she had wielded against me my entire life. She ordered me to completely liquidate my savings immediately. She demanded I empty out whatever meager retirement funds I possessed and transfer the cash directly into Derek's bank account. I kept my voice small and trembling, playing the role of the helpless daughter. I told her I barely had enough money to feed Leo and Mia this week. I reminded her that Derek had left me with absolutely nothing during the divorce. Catherine scoffed loudly, the sound vibrating through the phone speaker. She told me my financial struggles were entirely my own fault for being so incredibly ungrateful. She stated that Derek was the father of my children, and it was my absolute duty to keep him out of federal prison no matter the cost. She leaned into the phone, her tone turning venomous. She explicitly demanded that I sell my own organs on the black market if I had to, insisting I owed Derek my literal life to preserve the family reputation and shield my children from the stigma of having an incarcerated father. I smiled, watching her perfectly manicured face on the security monitor. I asked her to clarify if she was explicitly ordering me to commit illegal acts and bankrupt myself to fund a man who had abused me. Catherine snapped back that she did not care what laws I had to break or who I had to borrow from. She explicitly stated I needed to secure $200,000 by tomorrow morning, or she would personally see to it that I never spoke to my own children again. I thanked her for her honesty, confirming I had heard every single word, and quietly ended the call. I immediately forwarded the audio file directly to my legal team, securing irrefutable evidence of her financial extortion and threats regarding my custody rights. Back in the Oakbrook living room, the screaming match had reached a fever pitch. Derek was threatening to testify against Malik, promising to pull him into the federal embezzlement investigation if the family did not bail him out. Malik laughed arrogantly, pulling his cell phone from his tailored suit pocket to check his investment portal. He boasted that his firm was practically bulletproof, and Derek was just a desperate sinking ship. Malik tapped the screen, loading his accounts. The arrogant laugh died instantly in his throat. Malik turned ghostly pale. His hands began to shake so violently he nearly dropped the device. Ethan noticed the sudden terrifying shift in Malik's demeanor and rushed over, grabbing his arm. Ethan demanded to know what was wrong. Malik stared at the glowing screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked up, his eyes wide with absolute horror as he addressed the room. He stated the Environmental Protection Agency just froze all of Ethan's personal and business assets pending a massive hazardous waste investigation. Malik swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He announced that Apex Capital just issued an immediate margin call on their commercial loan. They now had exactly 48 hours to pay back the full $5 million, or they would permanently lose the house. Month 9 of my strategic dismantling brought the battlefield to the manicured grounds of Oak Ridge Elementary. The afternoon sun beat down on the chaotic line of luxury vehicles waiting for the final school bell. I stood quietly near the wrought iron gates, wearing my faded denim jacket and sensible sneakers blending into the background. A group of PTA mothers clustered nearby, sipping iced lattes and discussing charity galas. The peace was shattered by the roar of a supercharged engine. A white Range Rover swerved into the loading zone, tires screeching against the pavement. The tinted window rolled down, revealing my sister Caroline. She wore designer sunglasses and gripped the steering wheel with hands covered in fresh diamonds. Every luxury item she flaunted was funded by the loan I authorized to destroy her husband. Caroline stepped out of the vehicle, ensuring the heavy door slammed loudly enough to draw the attention of the surrounding mothers. She spotted me instantly. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a familiar expression of manufactured pity. She marched across the concrete walkway, her heels clicking sharply, deliberately, inserting herself directly between me and the influential PTA board members. Since we were teenagers, Caroline had always weaponized material wealth to establish social dominance, masking her own severe insecurities by tearing me down in public spaces. Today was clearly no exception. She projected her voice, ensuring her pitch was loud enough to capture the undivided attention of every wealthy mother standing within a 50-foot radius. She looked down at my worn sneakers, sighing with exaggerated sorrow. She announced that it was heartbreaking to see my children suffering due to my financial incompetence. She pointed toward the playground, stating loudly that it was a tragedy how Leo was forced to wear cheap off-brand shoes to school while his classmates wore premium athletic gear. The PTA mothers immediately stopped their conversations, their heads turning toward us like a pack of wolves sensing blood. Caroline reveled in the spotlight. She placed a manicured hand on her chest, her diamond rings flashing in the afternoon light. She proudly declared that she and Malik were practically carrying this entire family on their backs. She boasted about Malik's investment genius, claiming his firm was generating record profits, and they were actively looking into establishing a charitable trust just to support unfortunate relatives like me. I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic performance hang in the warm air. I did not flinch under the judgmental stares of the surrounding mothers. I looked directly into Caroline's eyes, noting the frantic, desperate energy hiding just beneath her arrogant facade. I knew the truth. Malik's firm was suffocating under a margin call, and the fines on Ethan's land were bleeding them dry. They were entirely bankrupt, floating on a sea of predatory debt. I adjusted the strap of my canvas tote bag and pitched my voice to carry just as perfectly as hers had. I smiled warmly. I thanked her for her incredible generosity, but stated I was slightly confused about their massive wealth. I tilted my head, looking directly at the PTA president standing just behind her. I pointed out that it was incredibly strange for a financial genius to have his wife's credit card declined 3 separate times over a $20 charge at the school bake sale last Thursday. The silence that fell over the schoolyard was absolute and deafening. The collective gasp from the PTA mothers echoed against the brick walls of the school building. The president of the board covered her mouth, her eyes darting between Caroline and me, mentally confirming the humiliating truth of the declined card. The illusion of Caroline's flawless, wealthy existence shattered in a fraction of a second. The bright flush drained entirely from Caroline's face, leaving her pale and trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another desperate lie to save face in front of her peers, but the words completely died in her throat. The social hierarchy she had so carefully maintained was instantly destroyed by a single undeniable fact. The humiliation instantly morphed into visceral rage. Caroline's eyes narrowed into dark, furious slits. She let out a guttural scream of pure frustration. She lunged forward, raising her right hand high into the air, aiming a vicious, open-palm slap directly at my face. She wanted to physically punish me for stripping away her mask. I did not step back. I did not cower. I reached out and caught her wrist firmly in midair. My grip was ironclad, stopping her hand mere inches from my cheek. I squeezed her wrist hard, feeling the delicate bones grind together under my fingers. Caroline gasped in shock, struggling frantically to pull her arm back, but I held her firmly in place. I leaned in my voice, dropping to a low, icy whisper that only she could hear, telling her that the days of her hitting me were permanently over. I released her wrist, letting her stumble backward against the side of her fraudulently purchased Range Rover. She clutched her arm, breathing heavily, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and newfound terror. Just as the school bell finally rang in the distance, a massive, heavily armored black SUV aggressively pulled up to the curb, boxing in Caroline's vehicle. Two men wearing dark, nondescript suits and earpieces stepped out simultaneously. They moved with absolute tactical precision. They walked straight past me and cornered Caroline against her car door. One of the men pulled a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents from his jacket. He shoved the heavy paperwork directly into Caroline's chest. He stated her full legal name loudly for the official record. He announced with cold authority that she was officially being sued for accessory to federal wire fraud. He wished her a nice day and immediately turned away. Caroline let out a choked, breathless sob. Her trembling fingers went entirely numb and she dropped her car keys down in sheer terror. Month 10 began with the absolute collapse of my family's remaining social credit. Caroline's public indictment for accessory to federal wire fraud had severed Malik's access to venture capital. The domino effect was brutal. My parents, William and Catherine, were hemorrhaging cash daily, burning through whatever hidden reserves they had left to maintain their crumbling wealthy facade. Instead of downsizing, Catherine doubled down on the delusion. She decided to host her annual catered Thanksgiving dinner at the Oakbrook estate, acting as though the federal investigations and asset freezes were rumors. On a Tuesday afternoon, my burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Catherine. She did not ask how I was doing or inquire about her grandchildren. Her message was toxic, dripping with the same condescension she had wielded against me since childhood. She wrote that she was expecting 60 guests for the holiday and required extra hands to manage the event. She instructed me to arrive early, park on the street, and come to the back door. Her text ended with a directive stating I was only invited to help the caterers pass small appetizers and clean up the kitchen after the guests finished eating. I sat in the chair of my office staring at the screen. A year ago, that message would have broken my heart. It would have sent me spiraling into a depression, questioning why my own mother viewed me as nothing more than unpaid labor. Today, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculating anticipation. I forwarded the message directly to my legal counsel, Marcus, and instructed him to meet me in the downtown boardroom. An hour later, I sat across from Marcus at a sleek conference table. The view of the city skyline stretched out behind him. He read Catherine's text message aloud, his professional composure briefly cracking into a smirk of disbelief. He marveled at the audacity of a woman demanding free labor from the daughter she had completely discarded. He tossed his tablet onto the table and opened his briefcase. He stated that Catherine's timing was poetic. Marcus pulled out a thick stack of finalized legal documents bound in cardstock. He slid them across the polished table, stopping them directly in front of me. He announced with precision that the default period had officially ended at midnight. William and Catherine had missed their final window to cure the outstanding debt on their primary estate. By funneling all their remaining cash into Malik's sinking ship and funding their delusional Thanksgiving gala, they had ignored the underlying mortgage. Marcus tapped the top page, his voice ringing with finality. The foreclosure was complete. The bank had executed the transfer of deed. As the anonymous primary buyer of that distressed debt portfolio, I now held legal ownership of the Oakbrook estate. I picked up the documents, feeling the paper between my fingers. The deed bore my holding company's name. Every square inch of the sprawling mansion, the marble fireplace where William had screamed at Derek, the velvet sofa where Catherine had threatened my custody rights, and the driveway where they had mocked my poverty, now belonged entirely to me. I looked at Marcus and told him to cancel any further notifications to the previous occupants. I intended to deliver the eviction notice personally. Thanksgiving Day arrived crisp and bitterly cold. For the past 5 years, my holiday routine consisted of wearing a faded gray hoodie, hiding in the corner of my parents' kitchen, and scrubbing their porcelain plates while they laughed with their preferred children. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and bypassed the casual wear entirely. Today required an entirely different armor. I slipped into a custom-made burgundy gown, the heavy silk draped across my frame projecting authority and wealth. I fastened a pair of 2-carat diamond earrings that caught the winter light, throwing prisms across the room. I stepped into a pair of black stiletto heels. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The quiet, socially unfit, submissive woman Catherine thought she could banish to the servants' entrance was completely dead. The woman staring back at me was a corporate executioner. I walked down to my garage and bypassed the sensible sedan. I slid into the driver's seat of my jet-black Porsche Panamera. The engine roared to life with a growl that reverberated against the concrete walls. I drove out of the city, the tires gripping the asphalt as I sped toward the affluent suburbs. The winter trees blurred past my windows. I felt no anxiety, no hesitation, and no fear. I felt the clarity of impending justice. I turned onto the private road leading to the Oak Brook estate. The massive wrought iron gates loomed in the distance, flanked by hedges and stone pillars. I did not park on the street as Catherine had demanded. I drove the Porsche directly up to the main gates, the tires crunching loudly against the gravel. A private security guard stepped out of the stone guardhouse, holding his hand up to halt my vehicle. He was a new hire, clearly brought in by Malik to project an air of impenetrable security for the arriving dinner guests. The guard approached my driver's side window, his expression stern and unwelcoming. He clearly did not recognize my vehicle on the approved guest registry. He tapped the glass, preparing to order me around to the service entrance. I pressed the button, and the tinted window rolled down, letting the freezing winter air rush into the heated cabin. The guard opened his mouth to speak, but I silenced him by thrusting a thick, legally binding document directly into his chest. He stumbled back slightly, grabbing the papers on pure instinct. His eyes scanned the lettering of the finalized deed, transfer his authoritative demeanor instantly evaporating into confusion. I looked at him through my dark designer sunglasses, my voice echoing with absolute freezing command. I own the entire property now. Open the iron gate. The private security guard stared at the embossed legal seal on the deed transfer. His eyes darted from the paperwork to my face, his false bravado collapsing under the weight of federal property law. He did not speak. He took a rapid step backward and pressed the green button on his remote. The massive wrought iron gates groaned, swinging inward to grant access to my newly acquired land. I rolled the tinted window up, blocking the freezing winter air, and pressed the accelerator. The Porsche Panamera surged forward, its engine letting out a low growl as the tires crushed the white gravel of the long driveway. The Oak Brook estate looked exactly as it always had during the holidays. Catherine had spared absolutely no expense utilizing funds that legally belonged to her creditors to fund her elaborate social masquerade. The sprawling brick mansion was illuminated by bright floodlights. A line of luxury vehicles belonging to the extended family and Malik's alleged investors filled the circular driveway. I drove the Porsche straight up to the grand front entrance, parking diagonally across the brick pavers, deliberately blocking the valet lane. I killed the engine and stepped out into the biting November cold. I did not approach the service entrance by the kitchen. I walked straight up the wide stone steps toward the massive mahogany double doors. Inside the formal dining room, the holiday spectacle was in full swing. A massive crystal chandelier cast a golden glow over the 30-foot dining table. The family was seated at the center, surrounded by an audience of extended relatives and business associates they were desperately trying to impress. Malik sat near the head of the table, sweating profusely into the collar of his tailored shirt. He wiped his forehead, bragging with frantic manic energy to the men seated across from him. He was spinning elaborate tales of his firm's fictitious upcoming expansion, desperately trying to project wealth while his financial world burned. Derek sat a few chairs down, looking absolutely haggard. His skin was gray, his suit hung loosely, and he stared blankly at his plate, carrying the inescapable weight of his impending federal indictment. I placed my hands on the heavy brass handles of the double doors and pushed them open with a violent shove. The loud, concussive boom echoed through the grand foyer and instantly ripped through the dining room. 60 different conversations died in the exact same second. Silence dropped over the estate like a heavy lead blanket. I walked slowly into the dining room, my black stilettos striking the polished marble floors with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. The custom-made burgundy silk gown flowed seamlessly around my frame, catching the light from the chandelier. The 2-carat diamond earrings flashed brilliantly as I moved. I looked absolutely nothing like the socially unfit daughter they had banished to the kitchen for the past 15 years. I looked like absolute power. The entire family was physically paralyzed by my stunning wealthy appearance. Their brains could simply not process the visual contradiction of my presence. Catherine stood near the head of the table holding a heavy crystal gravy boat, preparing to serve Malik's fictional investors. She stared at me, her jaw completely unhinged. The color drained from her face, leaving her chalky and pale beneath her heavy makeup. Her hands began to violently tremble. The crystal gravy boat slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, shattering crash. Brown gravy and shards of expensive crystal exploded across the pristine Persian rug. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek. She screamed, asking whose clothes I had stolen to play this ridiculous dress-up game. Her shriek broke the spell of silence. William slammed his hands down onto the mahogany table and pushed himself out of his heavy leather armchair. His face turned a deep, furious shade of red. He was completely humiliated that his financial failure of a daughter was disrupting his performance. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. He hastily scribbled onto the paper, ripped the check from the binding, and threw it aggressively across the table. The small piece of paper fluttered through the air and landed near the shattered crystal. William screamed that the check was for $500. He ordered me to take his charity and leave through the back door immediately. He bellowed that Malik was expecting highly important investors to arrive at any moment, and my pathetic theatrical presence was ruining their vital business arrangements. I did not look at the check. I did not even break my stride. I stepped gracefully over the puddle of gravy and shattered crystal, walking directly toward William at the head of the long table. Just like the Thanksgiving 10 years ago, when he explicitly told me my graphic design degree was a worthless joke that would leave me begging for scraps, he was still trying to buy my submission. I stopped right next to his leather armchair. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for me to crumble under his booming voice, waiting for me to run away in tears, just as I had always done. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the stem of William's heavy crystal wine glass. I lifted it smoothly from the table, bringing the dark red wine to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the expensive vintage roll across my tongue. I lowered the glass and smiled, looking dead into his furious, bulging eyes. I told him that Malik's investors were not coming. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single guest in the silent room heard my next words. I stated they were not coming because Apex Capital just seized this entire estate. I gently placed his wine glass back onto the white tablecloth. I told him he had until exactly midnight to pack his bags. The silence that followed my declaration shattered into absolute pandemonium. 60 guests erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps, panicked whispers, and violently scraped chairs as they frantically scrambled away from the blast radius of our family implosion. Catherine stood frozen in pure shock, her eyes darting frantically between the ruined crystal on her imported Persian rug and my entirely unbothered expression. William remained rigid in his seat, his chest heaving with silent, uncomprehending rage as his brain failed to process the eviction. But it was Malik who completely lost control. The smug, untouchable veneer he had worn since marrying into this family instantly vaporized. He slammed his fist down onto the polished mahogany wood with enough force to rattle the heavy silver cutlery. The silverware clattered loudly against expensive china plates. Malik leaned across the long table, his face contorted in sheer panic, sweat dripping rapidly from his forehead onto his custom designer collar. He screamed that I was lying. He shouted that my story was impossible because Apex Capital was run by a reclusive billionaire in Silicon Valley. He puffed out his chest, desperately trying to reclaim his shattered authority, boasting loudly that he had personally spoken to the billionaire's primary proxy for months to secure his venture capital funding. I did not flinch at his pathetic outburst. I simply smiled, a slow, calculated expression that made the remaining color drain completely from Catherine's face. I turned my gaze away from Malik and looked toward the grand double doors of the formal dining room. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, subtle signal. The heavy oak doors swung open much wider. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the dining room carrying a thick leather briefcase. It was Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, and the very man who had spent the last 8 months expertly playing the role of the elusive Silicon Valley proxy. The murmurs in the crowded room died instantly as he approached. Malik's eyes bulged in pure terror as he recognized the man he had been groveling to, the man he believed held the golden keys to his financial salvation. Marcus stopped right beside me. He completely ignored Malik's frantic, pleading stares. Instead, Marcus turned his body toward me, adjusted his flawlessly tailored suit jacket, and bowed his head slightly. He smiled a sharp, predatory smile that terrified my parents and said, "Good evening, boss." Sigh. The sound of the word boss hit Malik like a physical blow to the stomach. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting his heavy dining chair. The horrific realization washed over his features in real time. The brilliant, untouchable financial savior he had begged for money was merely a direct employee of the quiet sister-in-law he had spent years treating like absolute trash. I nodded to Marcus to finish the execution. He stepped forward, lifting the heavy leather briefcase. He did not gently place it on the table. He slammed it down directly next to Catherine's extravagant holiday centerpiece. He snapped the brass locks open with a sharp, echoing click. Marcus reached inside the briefcase and grabbed a massive stack of thick, disorganized files. With one violent, sweeping motion, he dumped the entire contents directly onto the roasted turkey platter. Hot gravy splashed aggressively across the pristine white linen tablecloth, but no one cared. The damning documents fanned out across the center of the table for every single guest to clearly see. I stepped closer, pointing to the scattered papers, so every guest could witness the unmasking. I announced clearly that those documents were the forensic accounting reports from Malik's completely fraudulent investment firm. They detailed every single shell company, every missed margin call, and the predatory loan he took from my holding company to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. Catherine let out a choked sob, but I was not finished. I picked up a red folder and tossed it directly at Derek, who was trembling in his seat. I told the room that those files contained Derek's comprehensive embezzlement history from the corporate accounts. The paperwork proved he had been siphoning funds for 3 years to pay for his massive gambling debts. William stared at his eldest son in sheer horror, finally realizing his golden boy was a common thief. Then I picked up the final stack of federal citations. I slammed them down in front of Ethan. I declared that these were the finalized Environmental Protection Agency fines for the illegal toxic waste dumping on his supposedly pristine mountain resort property. Ethan's face twisted into a grotesque mask of visceral, uncontrolled fury. The harsh reality of his complete financial and legal ruin permanently snapped whatever fragile restraint he had left. He suddenly realized I was the anonymous tipster who had triggered the federal investigation. He realized I had systematically dismantled his entirely fraudulent real estate empire while pretending to be the quiet, submissive sibling. He lunged aggressively across the dining table, knocking over wine glasses and shattering plates in his highly destructive path. He screamed loudly at the top of his very lungs, his voice cracking with pure hatred. He shrieked that I knew the toxic truth the whole time. He yelled that I knew the federal agents were coming to seize the toxic cabin and completely destroy his life. He raised his right fist, preparing to launch himself entirely over the heavy mahogany table to physically strike me. I did not move a single muscle. Before Ethan could even plant his foot on the tabletop, three massive men wearing dark tactical suits materialized from the deep shadows of the grand hallway. They were my elite private security detail. They moved forward with terrifying speed and absolute precision. They intercepted Ethan mid-air, grabbing him by the shoulders and slamming him violently into the polished hardwood floor. They pinned him face down instantly, burying his face into the shattered glass, and spilled wine, neutralizing the active threat before he could even take another breath. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. The guests scrambled toward the exits, abandoning their coats in a desperate bid to escape the implosion. The mahogany doors banged against the walls as the investors fled into the night. Ethan remained pinned against the hardwood floor. He thrashed wildly under the crushing weight of my private security detail, his cheek pressed into the spilled wine and shattered crystal. His muffled screams of pure frustration were drowned out by the panic echoing around the table. My parents stared at the forensic accounting files scattered across the roasted turkey platter, their entire reality disintegrating before their eyes. The illusion of their absolute supremacy was officially dead. Derek stood up from his chair. He adjusted the lapels of his expensive custom suit. He looked at the federal embezzlement files bearing his name and swallowed hard. He stepped over a fallen chair and walked toward me, leaving his sinking family behind. He raised his hands, morphing his expression into a mask of manufactured affection. He stopped 3 feet away, safely out of reach of the security team. He flashed a brilliant artificial smile. He lowered his voice, attempting to sound intimately reassuring over the noise. He told me that we could fix this. He called me baby and declared that he had always known I was a genius. He insisted we could work together to rebuild the portfolio and keep the wealth within the family. I stared at him, letting his pathetic attempt at manipulation hang in the cold air. A sharp, genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly across the dining room. I did not bother arguing with his lies. I reached into the pocket of my burgundy gown and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen once, turned the volume to maximum, and pressed play. I held the device up high so the audio would project clearly over the chaos. A frantic, tearful voice filled the room. It belonged to a young woman named Chloe. She was Derek's long-term mistress, the woman he had been secretly funding using the embezzled corporate accounts. Between heavy, gasping sobs, her recorded voice confessed everything. She begged me for mercy, stating clearly that Derek was entirely bankrupt. She cried that he promised to leave his wife and buy them a luxury penthouse, but his credit cards were completely frozen. She pleaded with me not to involve the federal authorities, swearing she had no idea the money he spent on her was stolen. I stopped the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at Derek. His artificial smile had completely vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer terror. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly. The undeniable proof of his infidelity and financial ruin destroyed his final attempt at leverage. He stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of the table, entirely speechless. The revelation of Derek's absolute failure caused Malik to finally snap. His cultivated persona of the untouchable banking executive completely evaporated. He spun around and launched himself toward William. Malik pointed a trembling finger at my father's face, his eyes bulging with unrestrained fury. He screamed that this entire disaster was William's fault. He shouted that William explicitly guaranteed my software company was a worthless, pathetic hobby. He bellowed that he trusted William's assessment of my financial incompetence when designing his fraudulent investment strategy. William stood frozen, staring at his son-in-law in complete disbelief. He opened his mouth to defend his actions, but Malik refused to let him speak. The banker completely lost his composure, his voice cracking as he unleashed the final devastating truth. He grabbed the lapels of his expensive shirt and yanked them violently. He confessed loudly that he had secretly drained William's entire retirement portfolio. He screamed that he illegally utilized every dollar of Catherine and William's future security to cover his desperate margin calls. He shrieked that the money was completely gone, vanished into the black hole of his failed venture capital firm. The silence that followed Malik's confession was absolute. The air was completely sucked out of the grand dining room. William swayed on his feet, his hands gripping the table as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed down upon him. He spent his entire life valuing wealth above his own daughter, and now the son-in-law he preferred had stolen every last cent. Catherine could not process the devastation. Her mind fractured under the weight of the public humiliation and the complete evaporation of her wealth. She let out a high, piercing shriek. She brought both manicured hands up to her chest, clutching her pearl necklace with a dramatic theatrical flair. Her eyes rolled back slightly as she collapsed toward the ground. She hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, twisting her body to avoid the broken glass. She began gasping loudly for air, creating a horrific manufactured display of medical distress. She looked up at me from the floor, her chest heaving. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction. She cried out in a fragile, broken voice about her heart. She wailed loudly, declaring that I was killing my own mother. William immediately dropped to his knees beside her. He frantically grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. He turned his face toward the ceiling and screamed desperately for someone to call an ambulance. He shouted that his wife was dying. I did not reach for my phone. I did not call for medical assistance. I did not take a single step forward to comfort the woman who spent 35 years trying to destroy my spirit. I simply stood at the head of the long mahogany table, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. The security guards held Ethan firmly against the floor. Derek remained paralyzed by the table. Malik stood sweating and ruined. William cradled his wife in a puddle of gravy and wine. I just stared down at her. The ambulance sirens faded into the night, leaving a sterile silence inside the waiting area. The fluorescent lights of the local hospital hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the remnants of my ruined family. I stood perfectly still near the illuminated vending machines, completely separated from the chaotic cluster of my relatives. I was still wearing the custom burgundy gown, looking entirely out of place against the linoleum floors. Marcus stood faithfully at my right side, holding his leather briefcase like a shield. He projected an aura of absolute legal authority that kept the hospital security guards at a respectful distance. Across the room, the illusion of the flawless Oakbrook dynasty had entirely disintegrated. Derek sat slumped in a plastic chair with his head buried in his hands, fully comprehending that his mistress had exposed his bankruptcy and destroyed his marriage. Malik paced frantically near the triage doors, aggressively biting his fingernails as he mentally calculated the federal prison time awaiting him for stealing William's retirement funds. Ethan was nowhere to be seen, having been dragged away in handcuffs by local law enforcement after assaulting my private security detail. William paced the length of the waiting room like a trapped animal. His expensive tuxedo jacket was wrinkled and stained with spilled gravy from Catherine's theatrical collapse. He ran his hands through his thinning gray hair, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he desperately searched for a scapegoat to carry the blame for his total financial annihilation. His gaze locked onto me, standing calmly by the wall. The humiliation of losing his estate and his retirement fund instantly boiled over into a blind, vicious rage. He stormed across the waiting room, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. He did not care that 2 triage nurses and an orderly were standing just feet away, holding clipboards and watching the spectacle. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. His voice echoed sharply against the acoustic ceiling tiles, demanding the attention of the entire ward. He screamed for me to look at what I had done to my own mother. He shrieked that her heart had completely given out because of my vicious, unprovoked attack on our family. He stepped closer, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, and bellowed that if she died on that hospital bed tonight, her blood would be permanently on my hands. I did not shrink away from his towering rage. I did not avert my eyes or offer a single tear of apology. I stood my ground, my posture radiating an icy, impenetrable calm. I looked at his shaking finger, then slowly brought my gaze up to meet his furious stare. I pitched my voice to carry clearly and distinctly across the quiet waiting room, ensuring every nurse and bystander heard my absolute rejection of his guilt trip. I reminded him of a freezing Tuesday night exactly 5 years ago. I detailed how my landlord had evicted me and my two young children because I was $70 short on rent. I recounted standing on his pristine front porch in a torrential downpour, holding a shivering toddler against my chest while my eldest son cried from the biting cold. I vividly described watching William stand in the dry, heated comfort of his grand foyer, looking through the glass panels of his front door. I told the entire waiting room how he explicitly instructed his housekeeper to lock the deadbolt and turn off the porch light. I stepped 1 inch closer to his face, my voice dropping to a lethal razor-sharp whisper. I stated clearly that he did not care if his own grandchildren froze to death on his welcome mat that night. I commanded him never to preach to me about the sanctity of family blood ever again. The triage nurses stopped writing, their eyes widening in shock. William's arm dropped slowly to his side. The righteous indignation evaporated from his face, replaced by the crushing realization that his past cruelty had birthed his present destruction. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but the heavy double doors of the emergency bay swung open with a sharp swoosh. The attending ER doctor walked out into the waiting room. He wore a rumpled white coat and held a digital tablet. He looked completely exhausted and visibly annoyed, entirely immune to the manufactured drama of wealthy suburbanites. He scanned the room, his eyes bypassing William and landing on Marcus, instinctively recognizing the only rational adult in the room. The doctor cleared his throat, addressing the gathered family with flat clinical detachment. He announced that Mrs. Catherine did not suffer a myocardial infarction. He stated plainly that her heart was perfectly healthy. He looked directly at William and explained that Catherine had simply suffered a massive panic attack brought on by a sudden onset of severe unmanageable psychological stress. He dismissed her theatrical collapse as a dramatic physical response to a mental break, completely invalidating William's claim that I was killing her. William exhaled sharply, muttering that losing the estate triggered her collapse. The doctor frowned, checking his digital tablet with deep professional confusion. He stated that while administering sedatives, Catherine became highly delirious. The doctor's voice echoed loudly across the room. He revealed she was frantically muttering about a $500,000 gambling debt. He asked if anyone knew of this sudden financial burden as she screamed about illegal bookies threatening her life. William froze in place, his entire body locking into a state of rigid, irreversible paralysis as the horrifying reality finally set in. Malik let out a horrified gasp, his eyes bulging wildly. He looked at William, the dark math assembling in his panicked mind. Malik suddenly realized Catherine had actively used his missing company funds to secretly pay off her illegal underground bookies. The horrifying realization crashed into Malik with the devastating force of a freight train. He stood completely paralyzed in the center of the brightly lit hospital waiting room. His meticulously groomed exterior, the arrogant armor of an elite African-American investment banker, cracked and splintered like brittle glass. The math finally aligned perfectly in his panicked brain. The massive $500,000 hole in his corporate accounts was not a banking error, and it was certainly not a delayed wire transfer. That money was currently sitting in the offshore accounts of violent underground bookies. Malik let out a guttural primal roar that echoed down the sterile linoleum hallways. He crossed the short distance between him and William in two massive explosive strides. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the front of William's ruined gravy-stained tuxedo. Twisting the expensive fabric tightly into his large fists, Malik lifted the older man slightly off his feet and slammed him violently backward against the waiting room wall. A framed hospital directory crashed to the floor, sending shards of safety glass exploding across the tiles. The triage nurses shrieked, scrambling behind their reinforced desks to hit the emergency security buttons. "You thieves!" Malik screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he shook his father-in-law like a rag doll. He completely dropped all of his polished Ivy League corporate vernacular. The sophisticated boardroom mask vanished entirely, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic and rage. "I am going to federal prison because your wife has a gambling addiction." He shoved William harder against the drywall, knocking the breath completely out of the older man's lungs. Malik's eyes were bloodshot and bulging, his face contorted in a terrifying display of absolute desperation. He shrieked that he had stolen that money from his clients to temporarily cover his massive margin calls. He bellowed that it was supposed to be a 30-day bridge loan, a temporary fix before the impending Securities and Exchange Commission audit. He screamed that he had trusted this family, that he had believed their illusion of generational wealth, only to find out they were degenerate scavengers who had just signed his federal death warrant. Caroline, who had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock since fleeing the dining room, suddenly snapped out of her paralysis. She let out a hysterical, piercing scream that rattled the acoustic ceiling tiles. She lunged forward, her expensive high heels slipping dangerously on the wet linoleum. She threw herself at Malik's broad back. She grabbed his tailored suit jacket, digging her manicured nails into the wool fabric, desperately trying to pull him off her father. She cried hysterically, her voice breaking into ragged sobs, as she begged her husband to stop screaming that he was going to give William a fatal heart attack. Malik did not even look at her. He simply threw a heavy elbow backward, striking empty air, but forcing Caroline to stumble backward and crash into a row of plastic waiting chairs. William gasped and sputtered for air, his hands feebly clutching at Malik's iron grip. He tried to claim absolute ignorance, choking out pathetic, fragmented sentences about knowing absolutely nothing regarding Catherine's illegal bookies. Malik laughed, a hysterical, manic, and terrifying sound that chilled the entire room. He leaned his face inches from William's sweating forehead. He told William that feigning ignorance would not save them from the federal prosecutors. He spelled out the exact charges heading their way, listing wire fraud, gross embezzlement, and federal conspiracy. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he would violently roll on every single member of this fraudulent family to shave years off his inevitable prison sentence. I stood 10 feet away, watching the absolute destruction of the Oak Brook dynasty. They were no longer a family of elite, untouchable socialites. They were nothing more than cornered, desperate rats, violently turning on each other for basic survival. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity in my chest, no remorse, and certainly no sadness for the people who had spent my entire life grinding me into the dirt. I experienced only the cold, clinical, and highly satisfying thrill of watching a long overdue demolition. I turned my head slightly to the right, keeping my eyes locked on the violent scuffle against the wall. I looked at Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, who was standing perfectly still beside me. I asked him in a low-level voice if he had made the call. Marcus did not break his gaze from the imploding family. He calmly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, nodded once with absolute certainty, and replied that the timing would be perfect. Right on cue, the heavy automatic sliding doors of the emergency room entrance parted with a loud mechanical hum. The biting winter wind rushed into the waiting room, bringing with it two tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark tactical windbreakers. They completely bypassed the frantic triage nurses and the approaching hospital security guards. They walked with absolute terrifying purpose directly toward the chaotic brawl. They reached into their jacket pockets and simultaneously pulled out heavy leather wallets, flashing bright gold federal badges under the harsh hospital lights. "Malik Washington," the lead agent barked, his voice slicing through the screaming and the crying with absolute, undeniable authority. Malik froze instantly. His hands remained wrapped tightly around William's throat, but his entire body went rigid. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He slowly released his grip, letting William slide down the wall into a pathetic coughing heap on the floor. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and SEC violations," the agent announced, loudly closing the final distance. The second agent grabbed Malik's wrists, spun him around roughly, and slammed him face first against the hospital wall. Caroline dropped to her knees, screaming Malik's name in pure agony. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed through the dead, silent waiting room, locking Malik's demise firmly into place. The heavy doors hissed shut, cutting off Malik's desperate protests as the federal agents hauled him out. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the hospital waiting room through the glass panels, casting an eerie, rhythmic glow over the absolute devastation left in their wake. Caroline remained on the cold linoleum floor exactly where she had fallen. She watched the taillights disappear into the freezing winter night, her chest heaving with ragged, uncontrollable sobs. Her carefully constructed reality was entirely gone. Her husband was a federal criminal. Their massive fortune was a complete illusion, and her status as the untouchable golden daughter was permanently obliterated. Slowly, she turned her head and looked up at me. The arrogant, condescending woman who had spent 30 years looking down her nose at my very existence was completely gone. Her expensive designer silk dress was bunched and wrinkled around her knees. Her flawless blowout was a tangled, sweaty mess, and dark mascara tracked heavily down her tear-stained cheeks. She looked absolutely pathetic. She dragged herself across the polished floor, closing the distance between us on her hands and knees. She did not bother trying to stand up. She grabbed the hem of my custom burgundy gown with trembling, desperate fingers. She tilted her head back, exposing her raw, unfiltered panic, and screamed my name. She sobbed violently, clutching the fabric of my dress tighter as she pleaded with me to save her family from total destruction. "Nat, please! You have the money! Bail him out! Think of your nieces and nephews!" I definitely did not pull away. I stood perfectly still, silently looking down at the woman who had made my entire life a living hell. My expression did not soften. I stared into her frantic, pleading eyes and felt the absolute vindication of a delayed execution. I kept my voice deadly quiet, forcing her to stop sobbing just to hear my response over the background hum of the hospital. I asked, "The same nieces and nephews you told me to take to a homeless shelter?" Caroline gasped her breath, hitching painfully in her throat, as the memory hit her like a physical blow. I brutally reminded her of the freezing winter 5 years ago. I detailed exactly how I had called her from a public payphone, sobbing uncontrollably, holding my 2 freezing children against my chest after William had locked us out in the rain. I reminded her that she had laughed into the receiver, told me that my poverty was entirely my own fault, and casually suggested I check my kids into the nearest municipal homeless shelter before she hung up to attend a luxury spa appointment. I looked down at her shaking frame and stated with absolute icy clarity that she had no right to ever preach to me about the sanctity of blood or the welfare of innocent children. The sheer force of her own hypocrisy broke her completely. The terrifying realization that I was never going to save her triggered a massive hysterical meltdown right there on the floor. Caroline released my gown and covered her face with her hands, rocking back and forth on her knees. She began frantically screaming excuses, desperately trying to shift the blame for her monstrous behavior onto anyone else in the room. She wailed that she was drowning in the intense pressure of being the perfect daughter, forced to maintain an impossible standard while I was free to live my own life. Her voice pitched into a manic, unhinged screech as the dark truth violently bubbled to the surface. She looked up at me, her face contorted in a grotesque mask of pure, poisonous envy. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, abandoning every ounce of her remaining dignity. "It wasn't my fault, I was just jealous. I was the one who told Derek to cheat on you so you wouldn't be happier than me." She wailed that she had deliberately introduced him to Chloe, that she had secretly funded their initial hotel encounters, and that she had actively encouraged him to empty our joint accounts. She bellowed that she could not stand watching me build a happy, stable life with a husband who actually loved me, while her own marriage to Malik was nothing but a cold, loveless corporate transaction. The hospital waiting room went completely dead. Even the busy triage nurses stopped moving, staring at the shattered woman on the floor. In the far corner of the room, near the shattered remains of the hospital directory, Derek stood frozen. He had been staring at the floor, completely broken by the public exposure of his bankruptcy and the absolute loss of his career. But Caroline's hysterical confession acted like a high-voltage defibrillator to his stopped heart. His head snapped up, his eyes locked onto Caroline's kneeling figure with a terrifying intensity. The horrifying realization cascaded across his pale face. His entire life was officially gone. His marriage was destroyed, his professional reputation was pulverized, and his personal finances were eradicated. He was facing federal embezzlement charges, and his mistress had just abandoned him. And he suddenly realized that the ultimate catalyst for every single piece of his catastrophic ruin was not a natural decay of his marriage, but the petty, malicious, and calculated manipulation of his own sister-in-law. Derek let out a sound that did not even resemble a human voice. It was a guttural, feral roar of absolute, unrestrained violence. He pushed off the wall with explosive force, his heavy leather dress shoes finding traction on the slippery linoleum. He did not care about the nurses, the lingering patients, or the security cameras. He crossed the waiting room in 3 massive strides, his hands curled into tight, murderous fists. He launched himself directly at Caroline with terrifying, unrestrained speed. He grabbed her by the throat violently, hoisting her upward. Before he could strike, 2 hospital security guards suddenly tased him from behind, dropping him completely cold. 12 grueling months had passed since the brightly lit hospital waiting room had permanently transformed into the chaotic graveyard of the Oak Brook dynasty. A full year of relentless federal investigations, brutal courtroom battles, and the systematic clinical dismantling of every single asset my family had ever possessed culminated in this exact moment. The morning air was sharp and brutally cold as the winter sun slowly breached the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the sprawling, meticulously manicured lawns of the family estate. For 30 years, this property had stood as a monument to their arrogance, a fortress where they had judged, condemned, and destroyed anyone who did not fit their flawless narrative. The pristine, imposing facade of the brick mansion remained completely unchanged, yet the reality behind its heavy walls had been permanently and violently altered. 3 massive commercial moving trucks sat idling in the circular driveway, their heavy diesel engines rumbling a low, steady rhythm that vibrated through the freezing morning mist. The thick exhaust plumed into the freezing air, a highly visible testament to the absolute finality of this day. Standing directly on the grand marble portico was the local county sheriff, flanked by 6 heavily armed deputies wearing thick tactical winter gear. He raised a heavy metal baton and pounded violently against the solid mahogany front doors. The booming sound echoed sharply across the empty courtyard, serving as a final, undeniable death knell for my parents' reign of terror. He shouted with absolute booming authority, demanding that William and Catherine open the door immediately and surrender the foreclosed property. His commands were met with dead silence from inside the cavernous house. My parents had desperately barricaded themselves within their fading fortress, absurdly and pathetically, believing that heavy antique furniture and brass deadbolts could somehow halt the grinding, merciless wheels of the legal system. I turned the steering wheel of my custom silver Porsche Panamera, the wide tires crunching softly against the frosted gravel, as I pulled smoothly into the driveway. I parked directly behind the lead moving truck, turned off the engine, and took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute silence inside the cabin. I stepped out into the crisp winter air, holding a steaming cup of dark roast coffee in my black leather-gloved hand. I leaned casually against the sleek sloping hood of my car, watching the spectacle unfold with profound, icy satisfaction. I was wearing a sharply tailored black wool trench coat and dark, oversized sunglasses, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable control that stood in stark contrast to the blind panic radiating from the house. The sheriff spotted my arrival and walked briskly down the sweeping marble steps, his heavy utility belt jingling with every purposeful stride. He stopped a few feet away, his breath pluming in the cold air as he pulled a thick clipboard from his jacket. He informed me with professional detachment that the occupants were actively refusing to comply with the court-ordered eviction notice. He stated that they had shoved a heavy antique credenza against the main entrance and were completely ignoring all verbal commands to vacate the premises. He looked at me, seeking the final confirmation from the new, rightful legal owner of the entire estate. My private holding company had quietly purchased the defaulted mortgage from the federal government for absolute pennies on the dollar after William's assets were aggressively seized to pay Malik's massive corporate restitution. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present moment. I lowered the cup, looked the sheriff directly in the eyes, and told him in a calm, flat voice that he had my absolute legal authorization to breach the entrance. I explicitly instructed him to use whatever force was legally necessary to physically remove the trespassers from my property. The sheriff nodded once, turned sharply on his heel, and signaled silently to his deputies. Two burly officers stepped forward from the shadows of the portico, carrying a heavy black steel battering ram. They took their tactical positions on the top step, synchronized their movements with a short countdown, and swung the heavy metal directly into the ornate antique locking mechanism. The solid mahogany splintered with a deafening violent crack. On the third explosive strike, the heavy door frame completely shattered, sending jagged wood shards flying across the grand foyer. The deputies surged into the entryway, their heavy boots loudly stomping across the imported Italian marble floors that my mother had prized above her own children. Muffled shouts and frantic hysterical screams immediately erupted from deep inside the mansion, echoing down the grand staircase. I remained leaning comfortably against my Porsche, sipping my coffee, watching the final act of this glorious demolition unfold. Within moments, the deputies reappeared through the shattered doorway, forcibly dragging my parents out into the harsh, unforgiving daylight. The sight was absolutely pathetic. The untouchable elite socialites had been stripped of all their manufactured glamour and intimidating prestige. William was wearing a rumpled, stained pair of striped silk pajamas, his thinning gray hair sticking up wildly in every direction. Catherine was completely barefoot, wearing a faded velvet bathrobe, her face pale and contorted in pure, unfiltered panic. They were forcibly marched down their own front steps, struggling uselessly against the firm, unyielding grip of the deputies. In a display of ultimate wretched desperation, Catherine was tightly clutching a random handful of tarnished silver spoons to her chest, as if those tiny pieces of metal could somehow save her from total, irreversible bankruptcy. William's wild, bloodshot eyes darted frantically around the driveway until they locked onto me, standing casually by my car. The absolute humiliation of being dragged out of his own home by law enforcement instantly mutated into a blind, feral, and explosive rage. His face turned a dangerous, apoplectic shade of purple. He violently wrenched his right shoulder free from the deputy's grasp and lunged aggressively in my direction. He screamed a torrent of vile, breathless obscenities, his voice cracking and breaking as he cursed my very existence. He shrieked that I was an ungrateful monster, that I had maliciously stolen his generational legacy, and that I was a vicious traitor to my own blood. He closed the distance rapidly, his hands curled into shaking arthritic fists, desperate to inflict physical violence upon the daughter who had masterminded his complete and utter ruin. He did not even make it 3 steps. My private security detail, who had been quietly standing in the shadows near the idling moving trucks, moved with terrifying professional speed. 2 massive men in dark tailored suits stepped seamlessly in front of me, forming an impenetrable wall. They intercepted William effortlessly, grabbing his flailing arms and twisting them expertly behind his back. They forced him roughly to his knees on the freezing gravel, pinning him securely to the ground just feet away from my boots. Catherine shrieked in horror, dropping the stolen silverware. The spoons clattered loudly against the pavement, the sound sharp and final. I did not flinch. I slowly lowered my coffee cup to the hood of my car and took one deliberate step forward. I crouched down, bringing my face perfectly level with William's sweating, furious face. I slowly removed my dark sunglasses, ensuring he could see the absolute terrifying emptiness in my eyes. I kept my voice lethal and razor-sharp, dropping to a cold whisper that cut clearly through the freezing morning air. I am bulldozing this house tomorrow to build a park for Leo and Mia. You have 5 minutes to leave the premises before you are arrested for trespassing. Exactly 2 weeks after the final eviction at the Oakbrook estate, the heavy oak doors of the downtown family courthouse sealed shut with a resounding thud. I sat perfectly composed at the petitioner's table, wearing a sharply tailored ivory pantsuit that projected absolute financial and emotional control. My lead corporate attorney Marcus sat to my right, organizing a towering stack of perfectly bound legal exhibits. He possessed the terrifying calm of a predator cornering wounded prey. Across the center aisle, the physical degradation of my ex-husband was shockingly complete. Derek sat completely alone at the respondent's table. He could no longer afford the elite legal defense team that had once shielded him from his own incompetence. He was forced to represent himself, a pathetic reality that radiated from his trembling hands and bloodshot eyes. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that hung loosely off his gaunt frame. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy who had callously destroyed our marriage and emptied our bank accounts was entirely gone. The Honorable Judge, Eleanor Vance. A woman known throughout the judicial circuit for her absolute lack of tolerance for foolishness, presided over the courtroom. She stared down from the high mahogany bench, peering over her reading glasses with a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust directed entirely at Derek. Derek stumbled to his feet to deliver his opening statement, his knees visibly shaking against the wooden table. He desperately attempted to play the victim, leaning heavily into a manufactured narrative of profound injustice. He stammered frantically, sweating under the harsh courtroom lights, claiming that I was a vindictive, unfit mother who had orchestrated a massive psychotic conspiracy to ruin his life. He raised his voice, his pitch cracking with desperation, accusing me of maliciously turning his entire family against him, destroying his lucrative career, and weaponizing our children Leo and Mia to exact a cruel, calculated revenge. He threw his hands in the air and loudly demanded full custody and immediate spousal support, completely ignoring the absolute absurdity of his requests. Judge Vance did not flinch. She did not write down a single note. She simply let him finish his frantic, rambling tirade before turning her cold gaze toward our table. She nodded once to Marcus, silently granting him the floor to initiate the slaughter. Marcus stood up smoothly, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with clinical precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not match Derek's frantic energy. He simply began dismantling Derek's entire existence piece by piece. First, Marcus handed the bailiff a heavily redacted federal banking dossier. He clearly and methodically outlined Derek's extensive embezzlement records, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Derek had systematically siphoned our children's college funds to finance his secret offshore accounts. He laid out the exact timeline, showing the judge how Derek had prioritized his illicit activities over the basic welfare of his own flesh and blood. Derek opened his mouth to object, but Marcus immediately signaled to the court clerk. The large monitor mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. Chloe, the young naive mistress who had once sneered at me in my own driveway, appeared on the screen via a sworn videotaped deposition. Stripped of her designer clothes and clearly terrified of perjury charges, she testified with brutal honesty. She detailed every expensive gift, every luxury hotel suite, and every illegal wire transfer Derek had provided her using my stolen money. She explicitly confirmed on the federal record that Derek had repeatedly mocked his children and expressed zero interest in being a father. Derek sank heavily into his plastic chair, the remaining color draining rapidly from his face. He buried his face in his trembling hands, but Marcus was not finished. The final nail in the coffin required absolute silence. Marcus requested permission to submit Audio Exhibit C. Judge Vance nodded, her eyes narrowing as she glared down at my ex-husband. The high-definition speakers in the courtroom crackled to life, playing the crisp, digitally enhanced audio recording from the hospital waiting room 2 weeks prior. Caroline's hysterical, tear-soaked voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. The entire courtroom listened in dead silence as Caroline shrieked her confession. They heard her wail that she was the one who told Derek to cheat. They heard her confess to secretly funding the initial hotel encounters and actively encouraging Derek to empty the joint accounts simply because she was jealous of my happiness. They heard the undeniable proof that Derek's entire betrayal, the destruction of our family, was orchestrated by a petty, malicious sibling rivalry that he had eagerly participated in. The recording clicked off, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in the courtroom. Derek looked completely destroyed, a hollow shell of a man, realizing that his entire life was ruined because of Caroline's petty manipulation and his own pathetic gullibility. Judge Vance picked up her wooden gavel. Her expression was a mask of cold judicial fury. She looked directly down at Derek, her voice ringing out with absolute undeniable finality. "Mr. Derek, you are a disgrace. I have presided over this court for 20 years, and I have rarely seen a more pathetic, cowardly display of parental neglect and financial malice." She paused, letting the devastating reality of her words sink deep into his bones. "I award sole legal and physical custody to the mother. You are stripped of all visitation rights pending a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Furthermore, your wages will be garnished indefinitely for restitution until every single stolen cent is repaid to Ms. Natalie." She brought the heavy gavel down with a violent, resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot. Derek completely collapsed. He slumped forward onto the wooden defense table and broke down into loud, ragged, gasping sobs. The sound of his absolute defeat filled the sterile room. I did not look back at him. I calmly stood up, smoothed my ivory suit, and walked out the heavy doors, stepping into the bright sunlight of a new day, completely victorious. 12 months later, morning sun poured through the glass windows of my $8 million penthouse overlooking the city. The space was a perfectly quiet sanctuary, radiating an aura of absolute peace. Outside on the expansive terrace, the joyful sounds of my children echoed. Leo and Mia were happily chasing our new puppy across the manicured rooftop garden. Their laughter was a beautiful melody that entirely replaced the terror we had endured just a year prior. I stood at the marble kitchen island, sipping espresso, completely absorbing the reality I had built. The heavy shadow of the Oak Brook estate was permanently gone. I had bulldozed the mansion exactly as promised, turning that cursed land into a private park for my children. The soft chime of the intercom system broke my quiet contemplation. I pressed the button, and the voice of my building concierge filled the room. He sounded uncomfortable, apologizing, before informing me that a woman was causing a disturbance in the lobby. He stated she was aggressively demanding to see me and claiming to be my mother. He asked if I wanted him to call the police to have her removed. I looked out the glass doors at Leo and Mia, ensuring they were completely absorbed in their place, safely isolated from the ghosts of the past. I pressed the intercom button again and instructed the concierge to wait. I told him I would be right down to handle the trespasser personally. I stepped into my private elevator, the polished steel doors sliding shut silently. As the elevator descended the 50 floors to the lobby, I did not feel any anxiety or anger. I felt only a profound, untouchable calm. The woman waiting below had lost all power over me the night she allowed her husband to lock my freezing children out in the torrential rain. The elevator chimed and the doors parted to reveal the grand, expansive lobby of my building. I stepped out onto the polished marble floors and immediately spotted the disruption. Standing near the sleek reception desk was Catherine. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The haughty elite socialite who had once judged the world from behind crystal champagne glasses was entirely obliterated. She looked incredibly aged, her posture stooped and defeated. Her once flawless, chemically maintained hair was dull and graying at the roots. She was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting, and unwashed polyester coat that looked like it had been salvaged from a discount bin. The heavy diamond rings that used to weigh down her fingers were completely gone, liquidated long ago to pay off their mounting legal debts. She looked like a broken, desperate stranger. As soon as she saw me approach, Catherine abandoned all pretense of dignity. She rushed forward, ignoring the warning glance of the security guard. She stopped a few feet away, trembling visibly, her eyes bloodshot and swollen from crying. "Natalie, please," she begged, her voice a ragged, desperate rasp that echoed off the high lobby ceilings. "You have to help us. Ethan is facing 5 years in federal prison for the EPA fines related to his illegal dumping at the factory. The government has seized everything he owns. Your father and I are living in a rusted trailer parked behind a gas station. We have absolutely nothing left. We are freezing. We are starving." She reached out her hands, shaking violently, palms turned upward in a pathetic plea for salvation. The arrogance she had wielded like a weapon her entire life had evaporated into pure survival instinct. "I am your mother," she sobbed, tears spilling down her deeply lined face. "You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You have all this money. You have this beautiful building. You have to forgive me. You have to save us." I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a fraction of an inch of sympathy. I stood perfectly still, looking at the broken woman in front of me, with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. I calmly opened my designer handbag and retrieved my slim leather wallet. Catherine watched my movements with a sudden, desperate flash of hope lighting up her ruined face. She genuinely believed her manufactured tears and biological manipulation had worked. She thought I was reaching for a checkbook or a credit card to wipe away the consequences of their monstrous cruelty. Instead, I reached into the back compartment of the wallet and extracted a single crisp item. It was the exact crumpled $100 bill that Malik had maliciously thrown at my feet on their wet porch 12 months ago. I had carefully smoothed out the creases and had the paper money professionally laminated in thick, rigid plastic to preserve it perfectly. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I looked down into Catherine's confused, bloodshot eyes. I reached out and firmly placed the stiff, laminated $100 bill directly into the center of her trembling, outstretched hand. Her fingers closed around the plastic, instinctively, her face dropping into a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. "Family isn't blood, Catherine," I said, my voice incredibly steady, cold, and echoing with absolute finality. "Family is who opens the door when it's raining. Go find a shelter." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on her completely, leaving her standing frozen in the very center of the lobby. I walked smoothly back toward the private elevator, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. I stepped inside, turned around, and watched the heavy steel doors slowly slide shut, completely cutting off the sight of my mother's weeping, devastated face for the very last time. In America, your worth isn't defined by the family who discards you, but by the empire you build from their ashes. Have you ever cut off a toxic relative? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and never let anyone tell you your worth. The story of Natalie's final encounter with her mother, Catherine, teaches us a profound, timeless lesson about the true definition of family and self-worth. For years, Natalie endured the painful sting of rejection from the very people supposed to protect her. When Catherine arrives at the penthouse destitute and begging for salvation from the wreckage of her family's arrogance, she immediately attempts to weaponize the concept of blood to demand forgiveness. However, Natalie's perfectly composed response, handing back the same laminated $100 bill that was once thrown at her in malice, illustrates that family is not an unconditional blood tie, but a bond forged through mutual respect and support in our darkest hours. The ultimate revenge is not screaming or causing a scene. It is the quiet, unbreakable peace of living a successful life, completely independent of those who once sought to destroy you. Natalie built an empire from the ashes of her family's betrayal, proving that our value is never determined by those who blindly discard us. Never let toxic relatives dictate your worth or hold you hostage to the title of family. Share your own stories of breaking free from toxic relationships in the comments below.